Today I'm going to make puff pastry from scratch. The ingredients list is actually pretty short, so I'll put it on my video and then you can pause, write down the list, and after that we'll get started. So first up, I'm going to prep the butter. Again, this is unsalted butter. Makes a difference in the flavor. You'll find some puff pastry recipes that tell you to slice the butter like this and create one long rectangle of butter. I don't do that, and there's a reason for that. As much as you try to seal the butter up into a rectangle, sometimes the seams will come apart while you're rolling out your puff pastry. So I use a different method, and that's what I'm going to show you. In this case, I've let the butter get to room temperature because what I'm going to do is make a mixture of butter and flour into something called beurre manier. And I'm going to mix this all up and get it soft, and then we'll add the flour. So a note about the butter. When you're making puff pastry, you really do need to keep the butter cold, but at this point I want to be able to mix it up. So what I'm going to do is make a mixture and then put it back in the refrigerator to keep it cold. I have the butter creamed, and now I'm going to go ahead and add a quarter cup of flour. That's about right. And mix it again. Now we have our beurre manier, and this is about the consistency that we're looking for. And next, I will lay it out in a pan. Here I've lined a 10 by 6 pan with aluminum foil, and I'm going to put the beurre manier in that. You don't necessarily have to have a pan. What you're striving for is some way to create a rectangle, and we will use that in a later step. Having the flour incorporated into the butter actually makes this job easier. Now that I have the beurre manier spread out in the pan, I'm going to put it in the refrigerator and let it cool, and it may take as long as an hour. We'll see. I'll be checking it after about a half an hour. The dough for puff pastry is actually very simple. We're going to take a cup and 2/3 flour. I use pastry flour for this. A half a teaspoon of salt, which I already measured. And we're going to mix that up. And then we're going to add a half a cup of ice water. When we first mix this, it's going to be very dry. And I will mix this for a minute, and then we'll put it out onto the board. Because this dough is so dry already, and we still have a lot of flour to incorporate into it, I'm not going to bother to flour the pastry board. What we have here is sufficient. And then we begin the process of kneading the dough, and we're going to do this for about 10 minutes. If we do need to add more flour, we can sift a little bit extra on top of the dough. This is a really good tool too, the pastry scraper. It makes it easier for you to pick up and incorporate all the crumbs. I've added a little bit of flour on top, and you don't want to add too much flour, but again, you don't want it to stick to the pastry board. And I'm going to set the timer for 10 minutes, and I will knead the dough for 10 minutes. I've been kneading the dough for 10 minutes. The timer's up. I'm going to sprinkle a little bit of flour here on the board and then lay the dough on top of it. That's what it looks like. And then we need to cover it with a bowl to keep it from drying out. And we're going to let it sit like that for at least 20 minutes. So our dough's been resting now for about half an hour. And what I'm going to do at this point is start to roll it out. The idea here is that we want to try to keep the shape of a rectangle. I'm going to roll it out now. I used a pan that was, what was it, 10 inches wide, I think, to put the butter in. So what I want to do is try to get a rectangle here that's about twice as long as the butter rectangle. While I'm rolling out the dough, I'm keeping it dusted just enough with flour. Keep that little sifter there, strainer, just so that it won't stick. This is a great rolling pin to have. You can also use one of those rolling pins that you can fill with ice water. I like my marble rolling pin. And it takes a while to get this out to the size that we need. It's really important to keep sharpening the edges, the corners, so that we do really end up with a rectangle. As we roll the dough out, it can go from side to side like that. Again, try to reshape it into the shape of a rectangle. You can flip it over and then keep rolling. It's also important to make sure that you keep the thickness as consistent as you can. So sometimes you might need to go out on the edges, roll it out a little bit more. So the pan that I put the butter in, measured 10 inches by 6. And I think we have our rectangle at about 20 by about 6.5. We need to leave enough room so that we can encase the butter. So we're going to need room along the sides. It's a good idea to keep a ruler nearby. And just so we know it won't stick later, slide this under. Okay. Our butter was in the refrigerator for about 30 minutes. Then I popped it into the freezer for 5 minutes just so that we could keep it solid. So what we want to do is make sure that our dough is going to be the right size to encase the butter. So I've laid the butter down here, and one thing I want to do is just even up the edges a little bit. It's a good idea. Try to make it as close to a rectangle as you can. At this point, I'm going to lay our dough on top. And now I want to seal up the edges. And notice there's a little bit of dough left here. I like to not leave too much dough because we're going to have spots then. If we do that, we might have some spots in our puff pastry that aren't exactly consistent. So once I get this seam together, I like to go around with this nice long spatula, remove the edges, do the same here and over here. Now that I have a nice clean rectangle, I'm going to gently take it off the board, put it back in this pan, because then we're going to put it back in the refrigerator for 30 minutes. Our dough with the butter encased in it has been in the refrigerator now for about a half an hour. So what we want to do, we need to work quickly to keep it cool. Is we're going to just lightly flour the board. Don't want to add too much flour. And then we're going to lay it out. And now, the temperature in the room, and actually in the outdoors, what season you work in, can affect how well puff pastry works out. So it's springtime, it's starting to warm up. and I don't have the air conditioning on, I know I'm going to need to work quickly. So first thing we want to do, we're going to lay it out like this. Keep the fold on that side, and we're just going to gently tap it like that, just to start loosening things up. Okay, now we're going to roll it out and do this very gently at first. This will take time, but what we want to do is make sure we preserve all of those layers. As we're rolling it, we want to also make sure that we keep the edges square, so we stop every once in a while. The rolling out is probably, it's not difficult, but it's the thing that takes the longest when you want to make homemade puff pastry. So we do this gently until we get it to the right size. One thing we want to make sure we do when we're rolling it out is to be gentle. Don't apply a lot of force. That's why I think the marble rolling pin is so good, because we're just using the weight of the pin. We don't need to press, we just keep rolling and let the weight of the marble work in our favor. Alright, so we have a rectangle about 18 inches long, a little more than 6 inches wide, and we have two options. We can fold in like this, in quarters, or we can fold in thirds. I actually like to fold it in quarters. This is called, people refer to this as a book. Fold it in like that, close the edges carefully, and then we're going to fold it over, seal the edges, and we're going to put it back in the refrigerator. So here I have the edges all sealed, and again we're going to wrap it up in foil, which actually does work better to keep it from drying out. In this weather, I'm going to keep it in the refrigerator for longer, not just 30 minutes, but I'm going to leave it in for a full hour to make sure it gets nice and cold. So at this point, we're going to repeat the steps that we just completed above. I'm going to do that 4 times. So we want to roll it out gently into a long rectangle, and because this is cold, which is what we want it to be, it can take a little while. So that's not the most difficult thing about making puff pastry, but it's the most time consuming. So you have to be patient and just roll it out gently until you get it back into an 18-inch long rectangle that's about 6 inches wide, and you continue to wrap it in foil, put it in the refrigerator for at least 30 minutes, and make another book. When you finish with that 4 times, then we're ready to make something with our puff pastry. So once we've been through the rolling process, and now we're on our final turn, and we have it rolled out to about this size, so 8 inches by about 4 inches. We're going to divide it up so that we can roll it out and use it to make nice things with our pastry. And I find if I use a nice sharp knife, I get better results. Okay, so here I'm working with 1/4 of the dough, and we want to wrap up the other pieces in foil, and I put them also in a plastic bag, keep them in the refrigerator. We don't want them to dry out, we want them to stay cold. So depending on what we want to make, and in this case, I want to make some apple tarts, I'm going to, again, gently roll it out, and what I'm trying to do is get a nice size square, multiple squares out of this to make apple tarts. So again, roll gently, take your time. Really nice. when you cut pieces off of puff pastry, it is of course possible to cook them and bake them, and they'll taste all right, but they're not going to puff up because you have to preserve that layer. So while you might be able to make them into something nice and tasty and add sugar, cinnamon, whatever, you can't expect it to rise like our puff pastry. So when we get to this point, we preheat the oven. I preheated it to 450 degrees. We need to bake these hot for a little bit. And now I'm going to use the apple pie filling to make tarts. This is the filling that I made in my last video, the sour cream coffee cake. I'm going to transfer them over to the pan for the last step. So what I've done is to line our pan with parchment paper. And then we're going to add some egg yolk wash. So because I'm working with egg, I don't want to do this next step on my pastry board. Certainly don't want egg to get into that. And what I've done is just take an egg yolk, stir it up, add a little bit of water, and then we want to paint it. You could have a small artist brush that's dedicated for cooking, or a brush like this, but what you want to do is be careful, and when you're doing round puff pastry, this is especially important, be careful not to let the egg yolk go down the sides very far, because the egg yolk will actually prevent the puff pastry from rising. So what's happening, I know there's a name for it, but in the puff pastry, the liquid that's inside the dough starts to steam up. That makes things rise. The butter makes the layers separate. And if you have egg yolk going all the way down the sides, then you're not going to get as nice of a rise, and in some cases you won't get the puff pastry to rise at all. Here's my last step before I put it in the oven. I like to use just granulated sugar here. I think you could use some of that gourmet larger crystal sugar, but it seems to me to be a bit much for a delicate piece like this. So at this point, I will put them in the oven. Taking the apple tarts out of the oven, and what I did here was to bake them at 450 degrees for about 15 minutes. Turn the oven down to 350 and bake maybe another 5 minutes. So you do have to keep an eye on these. What you want to look for is obviously that nice golden color, but you want to make sure that they're not going to burn on the bottom. And at this point, I'll take them off and plate them. Okay, so for this final step, I've taken the apple tarts out of the pan, put them in a little casserole dish, and sprinkled just a little bit of confectioner's sugar on them. So there you have it, apple tarts made with homemade puff pastry.